Some of the worst setbacks Rome's legionary infantry faced as it expanded the Eternal City's dominion throughout the Mediterranean were inflicted by armies skilled in the traditions of cavalry warfare, such as the light Numidian riders of Hannibal and the horse archers of the Parthian Empire. The always adaptable Romans took these defeats into account and, throughout the Imperial period, gradually began to decrease their one-dimensional focus on heavy infantry, and Roman cavalry grew into one of the deadliest, most elite strike forces that the ancient world had to offer. In our video discussing the Augustan reforms, we described the way cavalry units in the very early Principate's auxilia were organized. Auxiliary units made up of purely cavalry were known as alae, or wings, and comprised a total of either 512 or 768 horsemen, split into turmae, squadrons of 32 men each. These mounted legions were the pride of the Roman auxilia. However, more numerous than the elite alae were the various cohortes equitate, 608 or 1056 strong mixed units of both infantry and cavalry. A step down in quality from their counterparts in the alae, men of the cohortes equitate were therefore not as well paid, armed or mounted. Their duties differed just as their quality did. The various alae were intended as frontline, battle-ready crack cavalry units who spent peacetime undergoing training exercises which would keep them prepared for times of war, in which they would be expected to serve as the Empire's highly mobile strike force. In contrast, their comrades in the inferior cohortes equitate functioned partly as military units and partly in a support role. They would take on duties such as patrolling to ensure all was in order, policing the provinces, and performing escort duties. If a Roman tax collector needed a bit of muscle, an area commander might send a detachment of cohortes equitate with him. However, if a military situation became desperate, the cavalry in each mixed unit would be extracted and then merged together to form a makeshift alae of their own to supplement the superior quality troops. Much like their counterparts in the infantry, wings of auxiliary cavalrymen also possessed their own distinctive numbers and honorifics drawn from their origin, history and achievements. A brilliant example of this is the cumulatively titled Alla Gallorum et Thracum Classiana Invicta bis Toccata Civium Romanorum. This mouthful of a name in effect tells us part of the unit's own collective story. It was raised in Gaul to quell a revolt there during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and thus Gauls made up much of its strength. However, at some point a large enough contingent of Thracians was added that its name gained the et Thracum phrase. This particular cavalry unit's first commander was Classius, hence Classiana, and it was clearly an incredibly prestigious and battle-hardened force, having gained the title of Invicta, the Invincible, 2 medal-like golden torques, and the honour of Roman citizenship. Such a force would have been one of the most revered in its local area, and we can picture the ambitious men aspiring to be part of the Alla Gallorum for the prestige, honour and material benefits such a move would bring. Because the Romans themselves were an infantry-focused people, horsemen of the auxilia were instead drawn from former enemies who had been nurtured in the saddle, such as Germans, Celtiberians, Thracians, and especially Gauls, who made up a massive 44.5% of auxiliary cavalrymen by the Flavian period. Despite being formally considered supplemental to the legions, mounted units were in fact becoming ever more important as the military's role changed from expansion to defense. From the start to the end of the 1st century AD, Rome's legionary infantry strength grew only by 28%, from 300,000 to 385,000, while the cavalry forces more than doubled from 30,000 to 65,000. The equipment used by Roman cavalry units is difficult to pinpoint due to its diverse origins, especially in the early Principate. A lightly armoured Numidian would bring different gear to the battle than a heavily clad Gallic nobleman. However, Rome's tendency towards standardization, along with the Roman people's lack of interest in horsemanship, meant both that cavalry equipment gradually became more uniform, but that much of it was based on the ethnic origins of the auxiliary units, such as Celtic helmets. Set pieces of headgear were created especially to deal with the problems that mounted troops had to face in battle, possessing a large nape guard to deflect blows aimed at the neck, and cheek guards to protect the sides of a face. As Roman cavalry gained more experience of the threats it faced and how to counter them, the crown of Rome's Celtic-inspired cavalry helmet was reinforced with rivet-secured cross braces, which gradually rose until, in time, it formed a pointed peak. As their main protection, a smaller, lighter variety of shield made of plywood and covered with leather, known as the clipius, was used, which was either oval or hexagonal in shape. Most cavalry would also clad themselves in one of three types of armour, depending on preference and the situation: scale, lorica squamata; mail, lorica hamata; or the famous segmented lorica segmentata. As their primary offensive armament, 1st century Roman auxiliar horsemen would carry up to 3 lankia. The dimensions of these light spears probably weren't completely uniform, but a benchmark was around 1.8 meters or 6 feet long, suitable for either thrusting overarm or throwing like a javelin. Because Arrian tells us in his Tactica that cavalry might be expected to throw as many as 15 to 20 lankia in their training exercises, it could also be the case that grooms would accompany alae in battle, carrying additional spears to rearm the cavalry units. When their javelins were exhausted, alae troops would draw their 65 to 91 cm long double-edged broadsword called a spatha. It had a parallel edge but tapered to a sharp point, meaning that though as a cavalry sword it was mainly a slashing weapon, the point could also be used to thrust if needed. For their ideal mount, Roman horsemen did not require especially quick horses. Instead, it was far more important for the prospective steed to be short, stocky and compact, thereby increasing its load-bearing capacity and the rider's comfort. Analysis of 9 horse remains found at the Newstead Tremontium archaeological site in southern Scotland showed that Roman horses were similar in their build to the relatively small modern Welsh mountain pony. So it is clear that these were certainly not the massive destriers of medieval Europe. On these mounts, Roman alae troopers would sit in a so-called 4-horned saddle, which had been introduced into the cavalry by the time of Julius Caesar. To the Germans on the other bank of the Rhine, such equipment was considered weak and ineffective, but it undoubtedly benefited the Romans. When the rider's weight was lowered onto this saddle, its 4 horns would close and lightly grip his thighs to give balance without being so tight as to inhibit movement. This gave the horseman the ability to fight in melee with shield and spear, or to throw missiles effectively whilst controlling the horse with the legs. As the 1st century AD progressed, the Roman Empire began to experiment with new types of exotic Eastern cavalry, most prominently the extremely heavily armoured mounted unit known as Cataphractarii, a word derived from Greek meaning completely enclosed or totally armoured. These units were not new to the Romans, who encountered very potent cataphracts of the Seleucid Empire in 190 BC at the Battle of Magnesia, and then 147 years later came up against them again at Carrhae, where the Parthians used heavily armoured lancers to great effect. After Pompey's conquest of the eastern Mediterranean, Rome acquired a number of oriental client kingdoms who employed various contingents of Cataphractarii. Over a century later, in the Imperial period, Eastern-style armoured horsemen are noted among the numerous Roman allied forces during the Jewish revolt in 69 AD, but at this point they were only allied forces rather than official units of the imperial military. However, continuing pressure from the formerly nomadic Parthian Empire in the east and the Sarmatian threat beyond the Danubian frontier, both of which employed cataphracts, made the acquisition of Roman units of the same kind increasingly appealing, if for no other reason than to counter enemy heavy cavalry. It was the Sarmatians, particularly a tribal grouping among them known as the Roxolani, who influenced the first Roman Cataphractarii. They covered their entire bodies, along with the bodies of their horses, in iron scale, lamellar or mail armour, using a heavy lance known as the Contus Sarmaticus as their main weapon. It was this relatively unwieldy mass charge weapon which gave the first Roman cataphracts their designation, Contarii. It is possible that official Roman Cataphractarii alae were utilized before the 2nd century, but the first time we see definitive proof of their existence is during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, from 117 to 138. An inscription from the Italian city of Camarinum describes how the Cataphractarii of Ala I Gallorum and Pannoniorum served in Moesia against the increasing Sarmatian threat. Interestingly, it is possible that this unit was created by reorganizing, retraining and merging two previously depleted cavalry units, Ala I Claudia Gallorum and Ala I Pannoniorum, together as cataphracts. Since the troopers in these units were recruited in Gaul and the Balkans, it is clear that even from such an early date, Roman emperors were keen on universalizing such a formidable force throughout the empire as much as they could. Despite the fact that these units were now integrated into the official Roman military, however, they were almost never granted citizenship. Because of this, we can infer that early Imperial Cataphractarii units were still mostly made up of foreigners, such as Sarmatians, who accepted service in the empire's borders. Half a century after the exploits of Hadrian's new heavy cavalry, a unit of around 5,500 Sarmatian Iazyges tribesmen were sent to the town of Ribchester in Britannia after being defeated by Marcus Aurelius, but not all of this group was made up of armoured cavalry, many being infantry or even non-combatants. The increasing importance of fully armoured cavalry as the Roman Empire progressed makes it necessary that we qualify the difference between two ambiguous phrases relating to them, Cataphractarii and Clibanarii, the latter being translated as metallic furnace. We are never informed in the ancient sources as to what the difference between them was, but we can nevertheless make a few educated guesses based on unit structure, equipment, and tactics. The first possibility is that units of Clibanarii and Cataphractarii were synonymous, that they had the same equipment and origin, the only difference being their names. Other scholars believe that Clibanarii were more extreme in terms of their heavy equipment, possibly serving as the fully clad horse and rider combination which made them almost unassailable in the right circumstances, whereas ordinary cataphracts may have had lighter armour or an unarmoured horse. It is also possible that it was the battlefield formations rather than equipment which served as the Clibanarii-Cataphractarii distinction. Author Marius Mielcharek argued that the cataphract was a heavy mounted spearman fighting in extremely close ranks, filing in column order, while the Clibanarii were employed in shock-based wedge formations. It seems that units of super heavy cavalry were not all focused on charging en masse into enemy formations with the lance. Many of them, particularly those raised in areas with a nomadic tradition, combined their cataphractarius armour and mounted archery to create a unique force of totally armoured heavy horse archers, known as the Equites Sagittarii Clibanarii. A contingent of these troops were recruited from the eastern regions of Osrhoene and Armenia by Alexander Severus during his campaign against Sassanid Persia in 234. After that war concluded, the eastern cavalry accompanied their emperor to the western provinces and fought for years against the Germanic tribes with lethal effectiveness. Just to illustrate that older styles of cavalry were indeed still in use alongside the new heavier units, however, mounted archers fought against the Germans together with contingents made up of light Mauritanian javeliniers. From the 3rd century onward, usage of cataphracts of all kinds became more common until they eventually emerged as one of the foremost elite troop types of the entire Roman military, even serving as units of the Scholaris, Imperial Guard contingents created by Constantine after he disbanded the Praetorians. Their distinctive protection and weaponry gave Roman cataphracts a reputation of almost invincibility, which comes down to us in the sources even today. But what exactly were they equipped with? Like significant amounts of cavalry armament in the history of the Roman Empire, cataphractarii equipment was either directly looted from or inspired by the equipment of enemy mounted units, from people such as the Sarmatians or Persians. As described before, The main weapon of most cataphracts was the contus sarmaticus, a 13 to 15 foot or 4 to 4.5 meter long heavy lance. For scale, this size made it only a small degree shorter than the famous sarissa used by Alexander's phalangites. In contrast to the vast majority of mounted unit types of the age, who usually used a weapon in one hand and a shield in the other, Cataphractarii used the contus as a two-handed weapon, holding it at the horse's flank during a charge. The smaller secondary weapon of individual cataphracts probably depended on personal preference or the judgment of a unit commander. A variety of swords were used, including longer Sarmatian pieces, and even an exotic weapon all the way from China, which was found in a famous burial site of a Romano-Thracian cavalryman at Tatalca in modern Bulgaria. Other Roman cataphract secondary weapons included spiked maces, adapted from the Persians, and heavy axes, which the Notitia Dignitatum tells us the Imperial Guard cavalry of the 4th century used in battle. The early use by heavy cavalrymen of missile weapons, such as bows, depended almost entirely on whether the cavalrymen were trained in its use by origin. On Trajan's column, for example, heavily armoured nomadic Sarmatians are shown to be pivoting in the saddle in a Parthian shot position. As mentioned earlier, a bow was also the main weapon of Alexander Severus's Osronian heavy cavalry. Such a weapon had a composite wooden shaft with a glued layer of sinew covering the outside, while bone knock plates were applied on the tips. In the late Empire, it seems that most units of heavy cavalry, Sagittarii Climbinarii, were equipped much like the mounted archer of the steppe, able to shoot from horseback, whilst also retaining the impact of a charging lancer. For their defensive equipment, the general trend is that over time, Cataphractarii armour gradually expanded to shield as much of the horseman's body as possible, almost totally enclosing the rider from the outside world and creating what was considered to be an ancient tank. To protect their head and neck, Roman cataphracts wore an improved version of the egg-shaped Sarmatian helmet. These were the prototype for a subsequent variant of conical helmet known as the Spangenhelm, which also took inspiration from pieces of Parthian equipment. The headgear of an ordinary Roman cataphract could be worn with a mail section covering the cavalryman's face for extra protection. However, it was also common for officers, standard-bearers, and other high-ranking soldiers to adorn their helmets with a mask, appearing like a face. A famous example of the mask helmet once again comes from the Romano-Thracian cavalryman burial at Tatalca. To mark their prestige, helmets were also adorned with crests, feathers of bright colours, and other decorations that the soldier or officer might be able to afford. Such displays might also have had the effect of intimidating enemy troops facing off against them. Ammianus Marcellinus articulates the reputation of the cataphracts and gives us a vivid image of their body and limb armour when he says, "The equites cataphractarii were so protected by armoured coverings and belts of steel that you might think them statues chiselled by the hand of Praxiteles, not men." Praxiteles was the greatest Athenian sculptor of the 4th century BC. From his description, we can distinguish a sense of inhumanity about the cataphracts, that these elite horsemen ceased being human and were instead a kind of golem upon donning their armour and helmet, purely focused on war. Our series on the Roman armies will continue all the way to 1453, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.